Now we will see transaction state diagram. So this is nothing but a transaction state diagram. The states are active, partially committed, committed, failed, aborted, end. One by one we will see what is the active state. So here active state means if a transaction is in execution, then it is said to be in active state. So here whenever the transaction is in execution, then you can say that the transaction is in active state. Here whenever the transaction, this is nothing but a transaction. If this transaction is in execution, then you can say that the transaction is in active state. It doesn't matter which step is in execution, unless the transaction is execution, it remains in active state. Whatever the operation it is going to be executed, okay, the transaction is in active state only. Next state is here failed state. Here failed state means if a transaction is executed, and failure occurs, either a hardware failure or software failure, then the transaction goes into the failed state from active state. So here whenever the transaction is executing, for example this transaction is going to be executing and a failure occurs at this operation, a failure is occurred like software failure or hardware failure is occurred, then the transaction goes into failed state. Okay, from active state to it will go to the failed state. So whenever the transaction is going to execute, if the hardware or software failure occurs, then the transaction goes from active to failed state. Next one, partially committed state. Partially committed state means a transaction contains number of read-write operations. Once the whole transaction is successfully executed, the transaction goes into partial committed state where we have all the read-write operations performed on the main memory instead of actual database. While making the changes in the actual database, if sudden failure occurs, the state helps us to roll back the changes made to the database. Partially committed means after the completion of transaction, okay, after the completion of transaction execute successfully, transaction goes into after the completion of execution, the transaction will be goes into the partially committed. In the partially committed, whatever the changes made, that will be stored in the local memory. Okay, that is nothing but that values will be stored in the primary memory instead of the actual database. While during the changes, okay, from the local memory, after that it will made changes in the database. So while making the changes from main memory to database, any failure occurs, then that transaction will be in the partially committed state only, and whatever the changes made, that will be rolled back to the database. Means whatever the operations we have done that are not affecting on the database. If the transaction is not affected on the database, means that is partially committed. Next one, committed. If the transaction completes the execution successfully, then all the changes made in the local memory during partially committed states are permanently stored in the database. Whenever the transaction is committed and whatever the changes made in the local memory, after the committed, the changes will be permanently stored in the database. That is nothing but a committed state. Okay. Next one, aborted state. Aborted state means if the transaction fails during the execution, then the transaction goes into a failed state. So here, if you observe here, the transaction goes from failed to aborted. If the transaction is failed at some operation, okay, then it will go to the aborted state. The changes made in the local memory are rolled back to the previous consistent state, and the transaction goes into the aborted state from the failed state. After the partially committed also, the changes made in the local memory, but to to do the permanent changes in the database if any failure occurs. So here it will go to the partially committed to failed state, it will go. Again from the failed to aborted it will go. So here whatever the changes made in the local memory, that will be rolled back. So here rolled back means whatever the changes made, that will be undone on the database. That is nothing but a rolled back. So here this is nothing but a rolled back. The process of undoing change to a database is nothing but a rollback. This is nothing but a transaction diagram. Active state, which is nothing but a active state means whatever the operations it is executing till the commit, the transaction is in active state only. Partially committed, some set of after the completion of all its operations, the changes made in the local memory, again from the local memory to it needs to make the changes in the database. During this process, if any failure occurs, then the state is nothing but a partially committed, and here the whatever the changes done in the local memory, that also rolled back. Next it will go to the failed state also. From the failed it will go to the aborted. Committed means after the after the changes made in the local memory, permanently the changes will be done in the database if the transaction is committed. Once the transaction is committed, the database changed its values permanently. Next one, after the failure, if transaction fails its execution, then it will go to the aborted state. So this is nothing but a transaction diagram. Please subscribe to